And what you do every day of your life, pretty much, is you get up in the morning and you have a job to do. Just out of curiosity, who here thinks that they've had the worst job? Anyone's got the worst job? Who thinks that they've had the worst job in the past? The one thing you discover at these moments is that your job does not define your identity, right? It's in those worst job moments, you don't actually look to your job to define who you are. But what, generally speaking, though, I think we do have a challenge. And the challenge is that there is a natural tendency in the everyday life to start allowing our job to define who we are and to give us that sense of purpose. And taken to the extremes, you can either become a perfectionist with regard to your job, that you need to keep doing well, you need to keep performing, you need to measure up, you need to keep impressing. Or number two, you just don't care and you withdraw and you do an incredibly bad job. Those are the extremes, but each one of them sort of shapes who we are and how we feel about ourselves. And it's really, though, as we look at things, we're still longing for something to fulfill us, something to make us complete. Something that's just going to give me purpose and validate me as a purpose. And so often it's easy to look at my job saying, well, if I don't have a sense of significance anywhere else in life, at least I can get a sense of significance from my job. And so you go to your job and you work hard at your job because that validates who you are. In fact, that can be so powerful that you'll actually even trade time with your family, quality time, or just time off, rest time. You'll trade that for longer hours at the office simply because it's at your work that's what validates you. That's what affirms that you have a purpose. And you got to find that somewhere. You got to get this sense of purpose from somewhere. And so what we do is we start striving a little bit harder. Sometimes we just want to get that promotion. Sometimes I think I got to get that raise. The idea that it's through my job that two things happen. One, it's through my job that I'm provided for. I provide for myself through my job. But secondly is this idea that my job actually validates my worth as a person. Here's where I contribute something. Here's where I'm needed. Here's where people respect me. Here's where people affirm me. And if I can do a good job there, then maybe I'll get a promotion and get that recognition, that acknowledgement, and I can move up. But it's interesting that no matter how much you move up, how much you perform, what you've done in the past, it doesn't solve the emptiness of needing to be somebody. We still long, we still crave that validation. We still crave someone valuing and respecting me. So I want us to talk a bit about that this morning, but I thought, the one way to really help this hit home, and what we want to be doing here, is sharing some personal life stories. And so I've asked Steve to come in and share a bit of his story around his past career and what he's currently doing. And just because I thought that ties in. Steve's story is really a lot about what we're going to talk about here today. And so instead of giving away any of the details, I'm just going to have Steve, why don't you come on up and share a little bit with us.
So just to share a couple of minutes, give you a little background. If you don't know me and you don't know my testimony, I'm going to share very quickly that and kind of bring it together so you understand who I am and where I was coming from. I had first committed my life to Jesus Christ and became a disciple of His when I was 24 years of age. And it was at a church in Burnaby, British Columbia, and there it was where my future really began to take shape of what I was going to do. But what I discovered was once I started following Jesus, I really sensed that He was directing me down a different path than where I had originally started. My background and my schooling at that point had now brought me to marketing, advertising career. And but yet it seemed like Jesus was leading me to take on the role of an elder, or what we call a pastor, same term in the church. Now, granted, I still had a lot to grow in my faith. I still had some maturing to do, but even then, I just simply did not want to be a pastor because I wanted to accomplish my career, because that gave me significance. And I didn't want to be a pastor. They didn't look cool to me. And so they still don't. I'm kidding. Rob does. Rob makes it look good. But to be a pastor, you see, that meant I had to accept the role that God had laid out for me, meaning that I had to give up other things, or I thought I had to give up other things anyways. And that simply meant that my life would not be my own. I would be then submitting and answering to a higher authority other than me. Now, don't get me wrong. I was involved in the church. I was involved in and I'd committed to attending. I had was helping out. I was serving in different capacities. I even would teach on occasion. But I continued to evade these steps towards taking on the specific role that God was calling me to, because I really enjoyed what I did in the marketing world. I met Debbie in those early days, and it was a year later after I met her, actually to the day. I met her June 10th, 1988. We got married June 10th, 1989. Pretty quick. But I knew if anybody's ever seen her, you'll understand why I would fall for her. Now, you might scratch your head about why she would fall for me, but I fell for her certainly, and I was a salesman, so I sold her the moon and ended up marrying her. Anyways, so I was being discipled at this church that she and I had got married in, but I had already had my future career mapped out, planned out in the sales and marketing. I was working for a company in Vancouver at the time, and really cut my teeth in that industry, learning what would help me in the future of my career. So I loved the marketing world. I loved the advertising. I loved the challenge. I loved doing what it was. That was my wheelhouse. That was where I shone. And so I really poured myself into that world. Eventually, we moved to Saskatoon, where I continued to grow in the industry. I ended up becoming the regional director of dealer representation for a construction company, setting up dealerships and companies and stores throughout Saskatchewan, northern Alberta, some parts of Northwest Territories as well, which took a bit of travel, but it was enjoyable. I loved doing that. Loved the challenge, connecting with people. And making good money helped, by the way. And so that fed into then my identity, into who I thought I was. However, at the same time, that pull to take on that role of elder was always there. And sometimes it was just like Jesus was whispering in my ear. And then other times it was actually other leaders in the church that Debbie and I were involved with that would verbalize it. Whether it's challenging me to take on an official role, or being involved in other leadership roles, more specifically and more definitively as an elder. But I would push back. But what happened was in 2000, I decided to take a step to maybe quiet the whispers from Jesus and to put to rest the verbal challenges that I was receiving from some of these other leaders about entering into ministry. And so I took on a ministry role as the executive director of Leadership Ministries, now called Leader Impact in Canada. And I was the executive director for Saskatchewan. And that involved a lot of things that also stroked my ego too, and I thought would give me satisfaction. And the pay was pretty good as well. For a ministry, it was actually pretty decent pay. So I was working in the business, reaching business leaders, professional leaders, and political leaders. So I worked a lot in Ottawa with the MPs and some of the other leaders of the parties. I worked with MLAs in the Legislative Assembly. I worked a lot in Bolivia, was the area that I was tasked with. And so we'd work with foreign ambassadors and connecting with the leaders and political leaders, business leaders and professional leaders in some of these other countries. And we saw a lot of impact for Christ. I mean, there were some good things that happened out of that. And again, I enjoyed it, saw a lot of good things. But ultimately, at the end of the day, even though it might be stroking my ego and it was filling a certain need for me, that again came back to the fact that that's not what God had created me for. And He had something else for me to do. And really, as I learned later on, He wanted me to serve Him within the church as an elder pastor. That kept coming back to me. Anyways, after 4 years, I was offered the position of the National Vice President of Marketing and Sales and Advertising for a company called the Caleb Group of Companies. And this is where it came to a head finally at the end. I liked working with the guys. There's lots of challenges. We had approximately about 2,000 employees that we were overseeing. We worked basically Ontario to British Columbia, setting up independent living retirement communities, marketing them, advertising them, all those kinds of things like that. Big salary, healthy bonuses, lots of perks. That didn't hurt, I got to tell you, at all. Debbie enjoyed that a lot as well. She didn't even have to go to work, and we were raising kids at the time. So there's some good benefits. But I felt like I was one of the successful ones, I guess you could say. You go back to the high school reunions and those kinds of things. What do you do? Well, I'm Senior Vice President of Marketing for this company, and a lot of people in the West know about Caleb Group of Companies, that kind of thing like that. And so anyways, I felt like one of the successful ones, certainly as far as the world considers success. The prestige, the money, the health, the wealth, the achievements, the accolades, all of those kinds of things in my career. It was good. So I was moving forward in my career. Now, this is where I want to kind of wrap it up for you of what this all meant. And I tell you this for this reason. See, at the end of the day, that didn't matter. Really didn't. I'm absolutely sincere about that. God had a specific role for me to accept in my life that I simply just wasn't accepting. He's my Lord, and I wasn't submitting to his lordship in my life. Earlier, I had said that my understanding of accepting that role as a pastor meant that I'd need to give up other things. Well, that meant that my life wouldn't be my own, that I'd have to answer to a higher authority other than me. I also believed a lie, is what was happening. That lie being that I held the answer to joy and contentment and satisfaction and purpose in my own hand. And as a result, I was saying that I couldn't trust God with my future, that I couldn't trust God with the identity that he had created me for. Psalm 37:4 says, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." And what I began to realize, it was around that point, it's kind of like if you know football, there's a time in the middle of what's called a halftime. And at halftime, no matter where you are in the game, the coach will bring the team together and they'll talk about, okay, here's what happened in the first half of the game. Now this is where we need to go in the second half because of all these plays that we made that didn't work, these systems that we put into place that didn't succeed like what we thought. Here's what we're going to do in the second half. Well, it was kind of like that point, I reached the halftime point in my life. And it was like God was saying, okay, listen, you've done all this in the first half. Here's what I want you to do in the second half. So I came across this verse, Psalm 37:4, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." And I began to realize that it's only when I really surrender my life completely to God and get to really know Jesus intimately, when I really get to know him, when I delight in a relationship with him, it's only then that my desires become a reality. And here's what I mean by that. When I begin to give up on Steve's desires and dreams and I begin to trust God with those desires, something amazing happened to me. Something incredible that I knew about, but I hadn't experienced personally. And there's a difference. See, what happened was that my desire actually came to the place where I couldn't wait to take on the role that Jesus had been speaking to me about, whispering to me about, directing me towards, and had created me for. And guess what? I actually stepped into that role in 2007, and I loved it. I loved it. It doesn't mean that every day is a bed of roses. Trust me, it's not. I certainly make a lot less than I did before. Prestige? Actually, I'm disdained. A lot of pastors and churches today in our culture are disdained by people in our world because of how they see the Church of Jesus. You know what? But today, I'd rather have all of that, knowing that I'm being obedient, than anything else. And anything else that I could get. That's because when I finally obeyed, Jesus' desires actually became my desires. Now, does God give you the desires of your heart? I would say absolutely. Absolutely, he does, yes. and even more for that matter. Now, it might be different plans or desires than you ever thought you wanted. Probably, in fact, will be different desires and different plans, and I'm putting that out there for you right now to think about. But here's the thing, trusting Him to give you these plans and desires of your heart that are extraordinary. And they're amazing plans when you simply put Him first in your life. And Paul said in Philippians 1:21, "For me to live is Christ and to die is gain." Now, please hear me when I say this. I hope I didn't frighten you about me leaving my job and my career. Not everybody's called. In fact, most people probably aren't called to leave their jobs and called to leave their careers, and for that matter, even to move from one province to another or to leave one country to another. Very few are probably called to do that. But we're all called to do this. We're all called to give up our lives. That is definitely a calling of each one of us, to surrender our desires for the life that Jesus has called us to live, for the desires that Jesus wishes to give, you see. And when we do, what happens is we gain, just like the psalmist said, we gain so much more than we could ever think to lose in the first place. Today, my personal vision statement is dying to know Christ, living to make Him known. And I want to make that my vision statement that everybody knows about. That's how I live. Now, if there's one thing I've learned, there's one thing. If there's nothing else, it's this. My life is not my own, and it's only as I die to my own desires, to these Steve desires, that the best desires are realized. And because the best desires in my heart come from Jesus and not me. And when I live that way, my identity then becomes Christ's identity. I don't have to prove anything. I don't have to try to create anything. I let Him create me into the image of Jesus. And that by far is better than anything else I could have ever done.
From prison camps, prison labor camps, where what they would have the prisoners do is go and dig a hole. And they'd have to spend all week digging this big pit. And it just was this hard work. It seemed meaningless. But just as they're finishing the pit and they've got this big mound of dirt, and they're thinking, I've accomplished something, at least for all the time I've spent. Hey, at least we got the hole made. And then the guards would tell them, now, what you have to do is take all that dirt and refill the pit. All right, and they used to do this because it used to just break down their morale. It would just destroy their sense of significance. Like they're working for nothing. It was all meaningless. They'd just dig a hole, and then fill the hole back up again, and it just would decimate their spirit. Because there's something in us that needs to know that we're significant. There's something that we need to know that there's a purpose to what we're doing. And I think we all struggle with that to some extent. Is what I'm doing with my life at all matter? Is it all meaningless? If I just stopped doing it today and walked away, would anything be really any different in the world? Does my life matter at all? And sometimes we start to really struggle with this sense of, does my life have value? Does my life count for anything? And when we do that, when we struggle with it, we always turn to something. And I want you to think through, what is it that you turn to when you're not feeling great about yourself? When you're not feeling good about yourself and your significance and your value and worth, what do you do? And we're all going to do something different. We're going to turn to something. But whatever you turn to just to give you a sense of you're okay, that your life is meaningful, that's probably a false idol in your life. For some of us, it can be sports. Well, I'm just going to throw myself into sports. And we forget about life and we forget about things because at least in my sport game, I can win, I can defeat, I can beat the other team. I can prove that we're good, right? And I might even be that way if I don't even play sports. I just have a sports team on TV that I watch. Well, I'll watch sports. And I will tie into those players and they'll become like family to me. Even they don't even know I exist. They're my team. And I'm cheering my team on, even though they could care less. They don't know you're there. They don't even know what you're doing. But there's something about me associating with them, and they're my team. And if my team does better, then I can brag to the others, and I can mock the others about how my team just beat your team. And there's something about that we're just craving that significance. This whole issue of gaming, like I love gaming, and I love playing games. I love even doing like sort of puzzles and things like that. But why? There's something about it that says, I can control, I can conquer, I can win. And even in a game, if I die, well, I can come back to life and do it all over again until I win, right? There's something about it. And so it's often we turn to something to fill that void of significance. And for each of us, it's going to be something different. But I really want you reflecting on, when you aren't feeling good about yourself, what's your go-to to fill that void? And the problem is that whatever we've been going to, apart from Jesus Christ, is an illusion. And the reason we go to it is it does actually give us something. But the good job that pays lots and you got the benefits and all the perks, that gives you something right now, doesn't it? Or when your team does win, that gives you something, right? When you are successful at something, you feel something. It releases those endorphins in your body, the adrenaline. And what happens is, though, that fades. And you want to get that same feeling back, that same sense of significance, that same rush, that same sense of, I can win, I am somebody. And so we keep chasing after it over and over again. But the problem is, it's like a bucket with a hole in it, isn't it? It just keeps draining out, draining out. And so when we think about things such as even our jobs and stuff like that, man, I'm hoping my job counts for something. I'm spending so much time doing it. I better make it count for something. I got to have the illusion it counts for something. And I look at my job for those two things. That one, it's me providing for myself. I'm providing everything I need. Whether it's all the perks or whether it's just the basic meal on the table, I'm providing for myself through my job. And so my job becomes a place of safety and security, but also I look to the job to give me that sense of significance. But the problem is that both looking at my job for that means of provision and my jobs as a source of significance, both of those deny the role God wants to play in our life. It actually pushes God out of the picture, because then I don't need God for provision. I don't need God to provide for me anything in life, and I don't need God to give me significance. My significance comes from what I do and from what I accomplish. And so it's interesting what God says to the nation of Israel, because they had the same issues. He writes in Jeremiah 2:13, he says, "For my people have committed two evils. First, they have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters." They've forsaken me. Instead of turning to me to quench their thirst, they've pushed me aside. Me, the fountain of living waters that can give them life, they've pushed me aside. They've put me off into the background. And secondly, what they've done is they've hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water. So just picture this big hole that they've created, and they've lined it to hold water, but the problem is it's cracked. And so even when rain comes and water fills the cistern, it just drains out. And then they're constantly needing more. They're constantly hoping for more. And it starts creating a stress in their lives, because my cistern is empty. I need more rain. I need more. Like, how am I going to provide for myself? How am I going to get water to feed my animals and for me, my family? And God's just saying, oh man, Israel, that's what your whole life is like. And that's why you're constantly lacking, you're constantly thirsting, you're constantly empty, is because you've been chasing after all the wrong things to quench your thirst for life and for significance, and you've been chasing after them, and none of them does it. None of them will give you what you're searching for. It gives you an illusion of it, because the rain does come for a time and does fill the cistern, doesn't it? But eventually it just drains out because the cistern's cracked, it's flawed. And what I love about this is God saying, you don't need to do that. I can be everything you need. I can quench your thirst for life. I can give you all the significance and all the provision you need. it's interesting that the very first statement, and we use this passage a lot, we refer to it a lot because there's so much depth in it, from Genesis 1:26, the very first statement about who you are and your identity as a person and where your significance comes from, it says, then God said, let us make human beings in our image to be like ourselves, he says. The God is saying that, God, the Father, Son, Spirit, saying, let's create mankind to be just like us, to be our visible representation on earth. And they will reign over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, all the wild animals on the earth, and the small animals that scurry along the ground. He's saying, let's create mankind in our image, and they will rule the earth on our behalf. And this is God saying, you know what gives you significance? Me. I created you with significance. I created you with value. Why are you chasing after significance and value? You are the ruler of this world. What greater role can you actually play? But what we've done is because we've pushed God aside, we've also pushed what God has said about us aside. And when we push aside how God's defined us, then what is it that actually defines us? What defines you as a person? And you're inevitably then going to look at two things define you as a person. What other people say about you, right? Wasn't it great what Steve was saying? Hey, I get the respect, I get the accolades, I get the affirmation, I get people telling me, hey, you should do this, you'd be great at that. Like, that's great. Don't we love it when people affirm you? So we look for people's affirmation, and secondly, what we look to is our performance. That if I can just perform well, then maybe I'm something. Maybe I'm somebody. Maybe I measure up. And so we start playing this game of measuring up, measuring up, measuring up. But the problem is it's a vicious cycle. Why is that? Because when have you ever actually measured up to your own expectations? When have you ever got there and said, oh, I'm there now. I can stop trying to measure up anymore? Because even when you get up there, you're saying, well, that's just for now. The next 10 seconds could be a completely different story. Like today, I feel great on top of the world. I had an awesome day. And then what happens tomorrow? You see, the problem is your identity is never established. It's always something fragile and insecure, up and down, up and down, up and down. And so emotionally, we become wrecked and we become stressed. Why do you ever experience stress? Stress is rooted in the fact that I need things to go a certain way so that I feel good about myself. And when they don't go that way, suddenly you don't feel good about yourself, and you don't feel good about life, and you don't feel good about other people. And this is what creates tensions between us. Because if you don't make me feel good about myself, if you don't affirm me, or if you don't allow things to be in place that help me feel good about myself, if I perform but it doesn't meet your expectations, now you're a barrier to my self-esteem. And actually, you control my self-esteem because I need your affirmation to validate me, and I need my performance. And if anything becomes a barrier to those, then I will either lash out, I'll control, or I'll withdraw, and I'll just avoid. And so we have these struggles. Jesus confronts both of these deceptions about where our provision comes from, where our significance comes from. He does this in one encounter with a few fishermen. It's kind of an interesting story. Let me just read it to you. Luke 5, 1-7. One day, as Jesus was preaching on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, great crowds pressed in on him to listen to the word of God. Wherever Jesus preached, wherever he taught, masses just were attracted to him. They clung to what he was saying. There was just something that attracted them to Jesus, that whenever he preached, masses appeared. Man, wouldn't that be great? Man, if I could just go out and just start preaching, and man, we'd pack out this room in a few hours. And obviously, Jesus is a little bit of a better preacher. But, this is what he's doing. But the people are pressing in so much. The crowd's getting so big, and he's on the shore. It's like he's going to be pushed right into the water. It says he noticed 2 empty boats at the water's edge, for the fishermen had left them and were washing their nets. Stepping into one of the boats, Jesus asked Simon, its owner, to push out into the water. So he sat in the boat, and he taught the crowds from there. I mean, that's the only safe zone he could get. And when he finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Now, go out where it's deeper and let down your nets to catch some fish." Master, Simon replied, we worked hard all last night and didn't catch a thing. It's sort of like, Jesus, you do what you do really well, but we do what we do really well. We're the fishermen. We know fishing. We've been doing this our whole lives. Jesus, I can tell you what's waiting out there. That's sort of his first initial response. But you got to be polite, and you got to respect who you're talking to. So he says, but if you say so, I'll let the nets down again. Jesus, you don't really know what you're talking about, but because you said do it, we're going to do it. So at this time, their nets were so full of fish, they began to tear. A shout for help brought their partners in the other boat, and soon both boats were filled with fish and on the verge of sinking. And why don't you think through, what exactly is Jesus trying to teach Simon Peter right now? What's actually Jesus wanting to teach you right now in that story? I tend to look at my work sometimes as the work is my provider. My job is the provider, and by extension, I'm the provider because I'm the one going to work and I'm making the paycheck. It's all about me, and it's all about my work. It's all about my performance. And I think what Jesus is simply just wanting to say to Simon Peter and those that were there at the crowds is just, your work is not your provider. You did the work thing, you came up empty. And they're good fishermen. They know how to fish. These aren't amateurs. They make a career, a life out of this. And yet what he's saying is, you tried the work in your way, and look where it got you. Your work, ultimately, is not your provider. So Jesus has them go out and fish again to let the nets down, and suddenly their nets are full of fish. And what's Jesus conveying? Saying, you know what? I'll use your job, I'll use your career to provide for you, but you got to understand, I'm your provider. Not your job, not the fishing, nothing else. Nothing else is your provider except for me. And see, this is something that we struggle with because we think, I got to perform well at work. I got to impress at work. I got to keep striving to get a higher position. I got to keep getting up because that's my provider. My job is what gives me what I need for life. And so often what happens then is we work God around our jobs as opposed to our jobs around God. Have you ever done that? You say, my job comes first. My job is what provides for me. And so my job dictates what I do. And then I will squeeze God in around my job. We've all done it. I squeeze God in because really this is my provision. God is just something extra off on the side. He just adds a little bit to the picture. And what Jesus is saying here to Peter, saying that's not true. Never work your job, never work God around your job. Work your job around God. They'd already given up fishing. They're already in laying out the nets to dry them. But Jesus says, no. Now, let's work your job around me, do what I tell you to do, and let's see if it's a different story. And so they do. Sort of a little bit of skepticism. They do it. But Jesus reveals, you know what? I'm the provider. That's such a stress reliever. When I view myself as the provider, my job as the provider, I start to stress over, how am I going to pay my bills? How am I going to make the financial ends of my life meet? I seem to have more debt at the end of the month than I do income. And God, what's going on here? Why can I never get on par? Why am I always struggling? And God says, that's because your job's your provider, not me. When I'm the provider, I also tend to stress over my work. I stress over deadlines. I stress over approval. I stress over promotion. Guys, and this isn't something that doesn't apply to pastors. As a pastor, I am just as guilty of this as anyone else. Because I can get focused on the job aspect of ministry, and I can think, I got deadlines, I got things I got to accomplish, I got to do all this, and where's the support levels going to come from? And I start thinking, my job provides. It provides me with respect, it provides me with affirmation, it provides me with a paycheck. And God said, Rob, none of that's true. The other thing that happens is if I really view my job as being my provision and my source of significance, I strive for more and more at my job. I also will tend to have a fantasy of what would make my life even better, because there's always a better job, or a better paying job, or a job with better benefits, or a job with less. There's always something about the job that could be better, and you start to fantasize about how the grass could be greener. But also when the job's like the key point, then it's what I focus everything in my life around, and not just God, actually my own family. Ministry is a really dangerous place. A lot of kids, pastors' kids, grow up resenting the church and resenting God because their father, their mother, their parents, whatever, they're so ministry focused that the kids grew up resentful of the church. That got their focus, that got their attention, that got their time, and the kids didn't. So we actually made it a very clear distinction in our family that says, this is our day off and this is our family day, and we will get out of the city. We're just going to go off and do stuff together as a family. We want our kids to know this is your day, and we're going to work really hard at nothing interfering with your day, our day as a family. And because I know that the job, even in ministry, there's always more need than there is time to fulfill it. Need in our culture is a bottomless pit. I could spend all the time counseling. I could spend all the time doing stuff. It's a bottomless pit. And at some point I have to say, you know what? My job is not to control what God wants me to do. God is to control what God wants me to do. And so the problem with whatever it is you turn to for significance and for provision, none of it's certain. You can lose your job tomorrow. You can be in a car accident on the way home today and be injured. Eric and Shelley, both of you had careers, but for health reasons, both of you had to step down. You get this, right? Things can happen that are unpredictable, that you can't not anticipate. And anything could happen, and suddenly your job can be stripped away from you. And then what's your significance? Where's your value? Where's your provision? Where does all that come from? You know, it's kind of funny. I love Jesus' sense of humor. Sometimes people miss that Jesus had an incredible sense of humor. And at one point in time, he and Peter are walking along, and they're approached by a tax collector. Listen to the story, Matthew 17. On their arrival at Capernaum, the tax collectors of the temple tax came to Peter and asked him, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" "Yes, he does," Peter replied. Then he went into the house. But before he had a chance to speak, Jesus asked him, "What do you think, Peter? Do kings tax their own people or the people they've conquered, or the people they've conquered?" "They tax the people they've conquered." Peter replied, they tax the people they've conquered, Peter replied. "Well then," Jesus said, "the citizens are free. However, we don't want to offend them, so go down to the lake and throw a line in." So what Jesus is saying to Peter here, does a king tax, in a sense you might say, does a king tax his own family? Does a king tax his own people, or does he tax the nations that they've just conquered? Well, no, the king taxes those people. He takes tribute from them, their crops from them, the money from them. But the king values his own people, and so his own people technically won't pay a tax. And so what he's saying to Peter, saying now, if it comes to like God's temple, I am the temple, I am the author of the temple, I'm the one that they all worship. Is it right for me to pay a tax? But he says, just so we don't offend them, here's what we're going to do. He's going to say, go down to the lake and throw in a line. Open the mouth of the first fish you catch, and you'll find a large silver coin. Take it and pay the tax for both of us. Isn't that kind of cool to think that with Jesus, you actually never have to worry about anything, any provision? I mean, this whole idea of the guy coming collecting the taxes, Peter's like, we don't have any money. Just don't worry about it, Peter. Throw a line in. open up the fish, take the silver coin out of its mouth, and pay the temple tax. Like, for me, that's just a Jesus sense of humor thing. He could have taken care of things in any ways, but he likes a bit of the touch of the dramatic because it hits home so clearly to us that, guys, we do not have to worry. Jesus can provide for every need you will ever encounter. So then why do you get stressed out about provision? Why do you struggle with who you are and your sense of identity when he loves you and he cares about you and he wants the best for your life? The author of provision, the creator of provision is at your side. Why would you ever stress about anything? Why would you do that? Back to the original story in Luke 5:8. After they brought in all these fish, when Simon Peter realized what had happened with all the fish filling the boats, he fell to his knees before Jesus and said, "Oh Lord, please leave me." Wait, does that seem like to be the response you'd expect? "Oh Lord, please leave me. I'm too much of a sinner to be around you." For he was awestruck by the number of fish they'd caught, as were the others. Why did Peter have that response? They just pulled in a bunch of fish. Because Peter had been listening to Jesus for some time now. Peter was there when Jesus got baptized. He would have seen the Holy Spirit descending on him. He's been around Galilee when Jesus had been preaching. This probably is not his first time ever hearing Jesus speak. So Peter's been hearing about Jesus, and even as he's speaking to the crowds right now about the kingdom of God and the righteousness of God. And then Jesus does this miracle in his boat. And so the issue here is now Peter is gone from thinking about the miracle, and he's gone thinking about the miracle performer. And you start realizing who Jesus is, that he is a holy one of God, that he represents the Father, that he is a miracle performer through the power of God. And thank you. And so what's happening is that Peter is gone from looking at the miracle to looking at Jesus and who Jesus is. But here's what comes next. When he sees who Jesus is, he then sees who he is in contrast to Jesus. And he is deeply ashamed. He now sees the sin of his life. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of playing a musical instrument and you play to the best of your ability, but then someone who's a professional plays and you think, I am never playing again, right? Like, I've been there. Or at times when like you're doing a nice drawing but then someone else has a masterpiece and you're like, never drawing, right? It's sort of that contrast. But for Peter, it's an issue about shame and righteousness. He sees the righteousness of Jesus, and as a result, all he sees is shame of himself. I won't read the story, but in Isaiah 6, Isaiah has a similar encounter where he has a vision of God seated on the throne, and the angels are all around. The seraphim with 6 wings are flying and calling back to each other, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." And at the sound of their voices, the temple shakes. And Isaiah is there, and he's seeing this vision of God, and the focus of who God is and his character is his holiness, his moral purity. And Isaiah's response is, "I'm ruined. I am absolutely ruined because I am a sinful man and I'm in the presence of holiness." And it says, I can't withstand this. It's destroying me. See, whenever you get a clear picture of who God is, you then automatically get a clear picture of who you are. And it drives you down to shame for the sin in your life. But this is great news. Because when you discover the shame and the sin of your life, then you can also realize that he's the one that can rescue you from yourself. And so what's going on here is Peter's realizing, "Jesus, you're too righteous for me. Go away from me. I can't even be in your presence." But the interesting thing is Jesus doesn't walk away from Peter. Jesus exactly knows how sinful Peter is. Jesus, through his Spirit, knows every wrong thing that Peter could have ever done. See, Peter could not hide who he is from Jesus, and he knew it. But Jesus does not walk away from Peter with all his sinfulness. Now, we don't know Peter's sinfulness, but we know our own sinfulness. And sometimes we think, God can't handle my sinfulness, but Jesus does not walk away from your sinfulness. This is the cool thing about the story. You know, you're stripped bare in front of the one who knows everything about you, but he doesn't walk away from you. I often think sometimes in my life that God does walk away from me. Oh, God, I've messed up so again. You can't love me. You can't listen to me. You'll never hear me. I think that way at times. But he doesn't. Listen to what it says in Luke 5:10. His partners, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were also amazed. Who wouldn't be? Jesus replied to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you'll be fishing for people." As soon as they landed, they left everything and followed Jesus. Not only did Jesus not walk away from Peter, he actually turned to Peter and said, "Peter, I'm giving you a fresh start. I'm giving you a fresh start that you can now turn from what you've been doing with your life in the past, and we're going to do something completely different." Peter had the option at this point in time. Does he say, "No, but my job is my provider, Jesus. I need to keep fishing because that's what I've always done. It's what I know to do. My Father's going to expect me to keep doing that because it's his boats. So Jesus, my fishing's my career. Maybe I can sneak you in on the weekends." No, but see, when you encounter God authentically and you understand who he is, and by default you see who you are, and when he then invites you into a new start, a new life. Isn't it interesting that Peter and Andrew and James and John immediately left their boats and followed Jesus? There was no question for them. There's no, "Gee, I wonder how we're going to eat tomorrow." Like, why would you even think of how am I going to be provided for next week? How am I going to pay my bills next week, next month? How's that all going to happen? Where's it going to come from when the master provider can pull a coin out of fish's mouth, or can fill your boats with more fish than you know what to do, and your boats are starting to sink because there's so much. Like, Peter, he didn't even have to think about this because he understood who Jesus was. And as a result, he was able saying, "Jesus, I give you everything. Jesus, I will leave everything to follow you." And he did. You know, Jesus isn't necessarily going to call you to leave your jobs as he invited the fishermen. I mean, that's kind of cool. What would you rather do? Would you rather do your current job or walk with Jesus? But you know, the reality is you can walk with Jesus without necessarily leaving your jobs if Jesus is walking with you at your job. He's not going to call all of us to walk away and go off to Bible college and do all that sort of stuff. But what he says is, I can meet you at your job. Just don't think that your job is your provider. Don't think that your job is what's going to give you everything you need for life. And if your job tanks, if everything goes sideways with your job, that shouldn't faze you in the least, because your job's not your provider. I am, and I'm right there, and I'm with you, and I'm beside you. So Jesus won't necessarily call you to leave your jobs, but he is going to call you emotionally to leave everything and follow him, trusting that he'll be your provider. He's what will give you significance. You will never have more significance than when you're doing what your Creator created you to do. You will never have more value and worth as a person when you're being who he created you to be in relationship with him. If you ever struggle with significance, it is always because you are turning to something else to give it to you. If ever you're stressed, it's because you're turning to something else to give you life. And you're forgetting that the provider is right there. Russell, if you want to get Julie to come back in. This whole issue here is that if we can just learn to saying, Jesus, I give it all to you, and I'm going to let you direct my life. My life will now evolve 100% around you, not you around everything else. You come first. Even my family evolves around you. My job evolves around you. Everything evolves around you. And when you get to that point of trust in your relationship with Jesus, you can understand what Paul says here in Philippians 4. Let me just end with this. Not that I was ever in need, for I've learned how to be content with whatever I have. I know how to live on almost nothing or with everything. Paul's saying I've done it both ways. I've had nothing and I've had everything, but neither of that mattered. I've learned to be content whether living in every situation, whether it's with a full stomach or empty, with plenty or little. He says, doesn't matter. None of my life circumstances have I discovered can change my contentedness. My contentment for life is rooted in something much deeper than my circumstances. My contentment in life, my significance in life, my value in life, my purpose in life is not rooted in anything out there. It's rooted in Jesus Christ, who dwells in me and lives in me. That is the secret to my contentment. That is the secret to my peace. That's why Paul is actually writing that from prison, possibly waiting for his death penalty, possibly waiting for a death sentence. He doesn't know. Is he going to live? Is he not going to live? He thinks he's going to live because he thinks God's still got more to do for him. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect his contentment, his peace, and his joy, because he said the secret to all of that is that it's not rooted in my circumstances. It's rooted in the person of Jesus Christ, who I've surrendered my life to. So now the question is, am I actually going to surrender fully, 100% to Jesus? Or am I going to keep holding back a piece of control? Or am I just going to trust him saying, Jesus, you can do whatever you want with my life. I give you permission because I trust you. I trust your love for me. I trust your value of me. I trust your purposes for me. Jesus, I just trust you. And so, Jesus, I give you the right to do whatever you want with my life. And whatever circumstances I face tomorrow, which could be messy, could be terrible. Jesus did say, in this world you will have trouble. But then what's he say? But take heart. I've overcome the world. I can handle it. I can handle your world and whatever it throws at you. I'm not going to keep stuff from happening to you, but I can get you through it. And I can provide. Will you trust me? Let's pray. Father,